Yay! Good morning. Welcome to the second part, Physiology. This is step 2 of the 7-step reset. Physiology is just one component of that step. It also involves mental state, physical state, spiritual state, and emotional state, and then self-image. Where's the self-image at that time? So if you think about it from a step 1 is the self, who we are, our current level of development, and we're probably continuing to work on that. So there is sort of a ceiling, a temporary ceiling based on step 1, where we are in our development. Step 2 is a check-in. Are we maximizing what our capabilities are? So step 1 is where we are. Step 2 is how well are we acting as the best version of ourselves within those confines. Step 3 gets into the actual stimulus reaction, and while that stimulus reaction is less than a second, it's the biggest part of the 7-step reset, has the most impact on it. But because it's happening so fast, I focus on physiology, because prevention, when you're dealing with 11 million bits per second, which is what the network of neurons, aka subconscious, is processing, that's the speed of their processing, whereas the conscious mind is only 50 bits per second. The way to deal with that is through prevention. Excuse me. Now, the 7-step reset came about because I needed to have a way for people to work through the 7 performance areas. And all this rolls up to dynamic leadership. But I'm doing a series in December, January, and February, and March to roll up the components. So dynamic leadership is very much aligned with emotional intelligence. The challenge I have with emotional intelligence, what it's become, when I first heard that term early 2000s, like 2003 or 4, what it's become, though, and it's the way scientists work, the way academics work, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper with more discoveries. The challenge is we're in this conversation now around emotional intelligence, around what's the amygdala doing, what is the bangle, what's going on in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and all this. And the challenge is that it's processing at 11 million bits per second. How are you going to do anything about it? I literally watch people real time thinking through how do these things connect. The reality is it's all neurons at this level of the conversation. It's not mental health. What we're talking about is becoming the best version of ourselves at any given time and being able to do it on demand. It's all neurons, 100 billion neurons, and there are nuances between them. So 86 billion or so in the brain, 14 billion or so throughout the body, but they all perform essentially the same way. They all deal with the myelin, they all deal with synapses. Synaptogenesis happens, pruning the neural pathways that are not being used in favor of the ones that are being used, and then you have different sets of neurons do different things. But trying to figure all that out when they're processing at 11 million bits per second, I mean, how much can you even count to in a second, let alone process and think about and understand? So what we want to do is have prevention, and then we want to build in the desired actions in at the habit level. We want to build them in, design them in, condition them in at that subconscious level, that network of neurons level, so they're in the network of neurons. So if the network of neurons is really associations, what we want to do is add new associations based on our life design or based on our quest into the network of neurons. So when something is triggered, it does what it does, which is associates the other things that are related to it. And that's where the conscious mind has the power, because it can relate the unrelated, and then we can bring that back into that network of neurons. So the conscious mind is the programmer. We program that network of neurons, but most people by their 30s have let that go. They've abdicated responsibility to manage the network of neurons because it's outgunned. You can't do it with corrective action. It has to be prevention and conditioning it in at the automaticity level. So that's what we're doing. We're making the automaticity align with our quest or life design. And I go live every weekday, 8 o'clock Pacific time. I'll move that to 7:30 and then 7, but I'll announce it and it'll be on the website, which is in the comments, 7stepreset.com/live. I'll eventually move it to 7 just to facilitate so I can ski without having to worry about my live event. And December, I'm focusing on crushing the anxiety spiral before it begins. In January, it'll be self mastery, leading ourselves. And the reason for this sequence is because we can't be the best version of ourselves out of a place of anxiety or fear or worry. We have to be at a mindfulness kind of state, a present moment command state, so that we can be that best version of ourselves. Otherwise, we're acting out of fight or flight, and it's very difficult to go from fight or flight to engage or focus and engage. And that's where we want. We don't need to fight or flight level that the system was designed to create, because we're not facing tigers. If we do face a tiger, certainly not every day. The reality is, because it's a network of neurons, it's not a mind, and it's just doing what it's designed to do for our safety. Everything comes back up to our safety. So it's not against you. It's just that there's some conflict in what you're doing versus what you need or what you're conditioned to for safety. And that's the tension that we've got to resolve. And that's why I have the 7-step reset. Yesterday I covered, and you can find this out on the wherever you're watching this. Yesterday's event will be there. I have to repost it because the audio went out a partial way through, and I will edit it and repost it on the same platform. So this is part 2. You'll see part 1 later on today. Now, yesterday I talked about how I've always viewed, for years, it's no longer that way, but I've always viewed this idea, going back into the late 70s, of how it's very difficult to see this peak when you have this peak in front of you. And to get to this peak that's in front of you, you have to go down into this valley before you can come up. And while this peak may not seem like it's worth it to go down in the valley, this peak is. And so there's this process that we have to go through, and that's coming back to the identity, that we have to be able to navigate these peaks to get to the one we want. And if we spend all our time and energy going down into this valley, when what we really want is this peak, we can use the 7-step reset and the 7 performance areas. So the 7 performance areas and the 7-step reset, they work together. 7 performance areas mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, those are in our control. And then relationships, professional, financial, involve other people. And the point is, we want to retain agency and personal leadership, self-mastery here before we can do this. Now, if you're already hijacked, it's very difficult to do this. These are fully in our control. Emotional is in our control, but it may seem like it's not, because when you get triggered or hijacked, if you watch a video of somebody being triggered and they scale up really quick, you can tell it's totally irrational. You can't reason with them. Or a person who's acting out a phobia response, you can't reason with them. You have to wait until that neurobiological event calms down. It could be hours. Once the fight or flight happens, it's no longer a mental exercise. It's now a neurobiological event. It's the network of neurons, the chemical cocktail, if you will, is already flooding the system, and that takes a while to get out. And it's designed to fight the tiger. But because we're not fighting tigers, why do you need to go through that? That's why I put that shift. So it's not fight or flight, freeze or faint. It's focus and engage. We don't need those other two unless you're facing a tiger, and then they're there in reserve, but you'll have a lot more energy to deal with them, because an emotional drive to deal with them, because you're not always stressed out. So we want to, I call emotional the gateway to the right side. Let's see here, we've got so here's the diagram that I'm using. Let's put this one. So what I'm saying is the left side is in our control. The middle is the gateway to the right side. So if we want to have productive relationships, uh, successful professional career opportunities, etc., and then the financial goals, that these require other people. If you're emotionally hijacked, it's very difficult to be the best version of yourself when you need to be as you're moving forward with this quest. So we set the identity, and how many new quests can you have in a lifetime? Who knows, right? But each time you have a new quest, if it's major, we need to reset the identity. Sometimes when I'm working with somebody, I can tell that the quest that they're going after is not big enough. It's not big enough to go through the necessary discomfort that is required. And so we have to go bigger. And this is where that 10x thinking comes from. If you take your goal, whatever it is, and you think about it, what does 10x look like? Now, this may not apply for every goal, but the idea is you then say, what does 10x look like? And what would it look like if I was achieving 10x? You'll recognize that there's probably some things that you don't want to do. The 10x requires you to do some things that you don't want to do, which puts it on the other side of these peaks and identities. And this is where the 7-step reset comes in, is that we don't have to go down into this valley. When you're working on this peak here, we're setting the identity for that peak. We're not setting the identity for this peak. So you don't have to do all of this. What we're doing is doing it enough to make this traverse over to the next elevation and then doing it again. But this is where you're going. It's very similar to if you're through hiking or doing a multi-day hike. You're not just thinking about, you are thinking about the next peak that you have to get to, but your mind is on the ultimate peak, which you can't even see. But that's the identity. So you're not rushing. You may see a through hiker starting out at, like maybe 7 or 8 miles a day, but by the end, especially on these 90-day hikes, by the end they're doing 30 miles a day, day after day after day. That's like doing a marathon multiple days in a row with no recovery time. But they're able to do that. But if they tried that on days 1 through 7, they're going to be injured, right? So you know that this peak is there, you're dealing with it, but you're focusing on the identity here. That's a way of thinking about it. I look at hiking as a great metaphor for how life works, because it includes the homeostasis, it includes the allostasis, it includes the challenges with the allostatic load, which I'll cover in a few minutes. It includes habit, it includes adjusting, and this idea of, yes, it's hard, but I will prevail. All of these come into play when you're hiking. They also come into play in other areas, special forces or special operations, military, Tai Chi, martial arts, etc. Then, following that one, hold on a second. Now, following that one, I then did this, and this is all again in the part 1 yesterday, where I looked at, this is us going through our normal life. We're just moving along, and then there's an artificial barrier above us. And it's difficult to get through this. This is what stops people, because you have your stories, beliefs, habits, successes, failures, trauma. All that stuff comes up here because every step of the way you have the potential of triggering an association, and those associations bring things in. And the way the network of neurons works, it doesn't necessarily seem like it's from the past. It feels like it's applied to what you're facing. So in other words, that trauma, I shouldn't use the word trauma, because this is not mental health, but those fears or setbacks that happened in the past, it feels like what's going on today, but it's just associations. And what we have to do is you have to be able to process those. You have to deal with the emotion that comes up. And as you do that, you're dealing with this constant cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance that's in this barrier is saying, you can't do this, it's impossible, you failed before. But you've got to keep doing the one step in front of the other. So the activities that are needed in here are different from the activities that are needed in here. And they're different from the activities that are needed in here. And I'll get into that in January, February. But for now, we're talking about anxiety, because we first have to get back to a status quo level or an even keel level. And the same way that this takes time to break through, when you fall down from your status quo, and you fall down through this lower barrier, and this lower barrier could be, this is where you adjust your diet or nutrition, or you adjust your sleep, or maybe you back off on whatever thing you shouldn't be doing or don't want to do, and that helps you get back up here. But if you fall through this, and this can happen, this is why when people talk about, oh, I'm going to quit my job and start a business, the people who've been there, don't quit your job. Make it work first, because you don't know what's going to happen when you fall through here. You don't know how much negative energy you're going to create for yourself because of past failures, setbacks, experiences, etc. Everybody's lived experience is different. You don't know what that's going to be. Here's what I'll tell you. If you haven't visited this, if you're 40 years old or 50 years old, you've been in the same job, you don't know what it feels like to be unemployed. Yes, you may have been unemployed in your 20s, but to go through that at 40 or 50, you have no idea what's going to come up for you, the amount of memories and thoughts and all this stuff. We'll talk about that later, but that's why in step one you have beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. And we're talking about step two now. So once you get that in a place that's working, that's functional and productive, then you're going to use step two as a check-in to make sure I am living the best version of myself. And then we have levers. So there's signals that I'm falling off track, and there's levers, and there's drivers. And that's what we'll be using in step two. That's what this step two is about. So when you fall down through here, there's a process to get back up. The point is, it can be done because this is all associations. And once you gain the process, once you have the process of dealing with associations and changing them, it becomes something that you no longer have to worry about. You don't fear anxiety spirals. That's why I call it crushing the anxiety spiral before it begins, because you don't have to worry about it, because you already know that you have the tools to deal with it. Now, so this is step one. Let's go to this slide here. Now this is the 7-step reset. You have the pre-stimulus and you have the response. When they talk about stimulus response, people think about this as a longer thing. This here is ongoing. This step 1 and 2 is ongoing. And it's ongoing because 33,000 times a day, we're going through a pre-stimulus conditioned reaction response sequence all day long, 33,000 times a day. And you can just Google everything I'm saying, but this will show up as how many decisions do we make a day. It'll say 33,000 decisions are made per day. And we know that 95% of all our actions are done by habit. So that tells you that there's about 1,500 of them maybe that are conscious mind. The rest of them are at the network of neurons, aka subconscious. And that is where we are all the time. Then the response is hopefully our conscious mind is coming in place. That's what the 7th step ensures, is that you're doing this consciously. You do not want your response to equal your reaction unless it's something that is either benign or it's highly operational. You've done it before and you've got enough sequences. This is if you're playing sports, then yes, your response will equal your reaction, because you've done it so many times. But without that drilling, you're not going to have necessarily the right response. The other thing that happens is if you're in an operational environment, widgets in, widgets out, it's easier to let your response, it's less concerning to let your response equal your reaction, because you've been there before, you've done it, it's operational. This is why project work is so much more difficult than operational work. It's difficult because you're having to engage your conscious mind, because the reactions that you have are based on associations, and those associations are from the past. And if you're building a project, by definition, you're creating some new capability, and that new capability requires a different set of steps, actions, requires a different identity, etc. And that's why we have the 7-step reset. If you were just going along in operational mode and not doing anything different, then I probably wouldn't even engage. You just keep going. But when your quest gets big enough that you feel like it's impossible, that's when we need the 7-step reset. And what I'll do oftentimes is challenge the person to 3, 4, 7, 10x the thing, so that they can feel that pressure and fear, and then we have something to work with. So the I wanted to cover what's going on in the step three. I'll get to step three next week, later this week and next week, but I wanted to paint a picture of what's going on. So from here to here is 1 second. This is about less than a second. This happens, and that includes the fore period, which is, believe it or not, the brain, because it's all energy. Everything is energy. Atoms, right? And atoms are 99.99999% energy. The brain and central nervous system is predicting what's coming. It's always looking ahead. This is similar to how if you have a video camera or audio recorder, it's listening ahead. So when you hit record, it picks up the prior 2 seconds. That's similar to this. This is before the stimulus happens. It's ongoing. It's all the time happening. You think about the subconscious, aka network of neurons processing at 11 million bits per second. It's always doing something. It's not just sitting there waiting, right? It's doing something. Here it's just checking, it's checking, it's checking. This is why you can walk into a situation and start getting stressed. You feel like, something's going to happen, and it's because it doesn't know any better, it starts associating things. The next 250 milliseconds, so the subconscious has a reaction time of a quarter of a second. You can look that up as well. In that quarter of a second, you might think it's just a delay, it's just a lag. What's going on is it's taking this information from the fore period, and it's making associations. Remember, 100 billion neurons, each neuron is connected to 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. That's trillions of connections. In this quarter of a second, it's going through basically the catalog of what's happening and what it needs, and then it brings in the association. So this is your heuristics. If you think about meta programs, you may have heard, I should say, you may have heard of meta programs. You probably definitely have heard of cognitive biases. That's where the cognitive biases come in. I say heuristics, shortcut for cognitive. It's a cognitive shortcut to shortcut the thing. And a meta program, think of that as a bundling of neural pathways that always fire together, always work together. I think of it, back when we were doing portals early in the 2000s, they call these things widgets, and maybe they still do, but essentially there's widgets. This was the program, the bundled programs, because it's always used. That's why so many of your login procedures look the same way. Calendars look the same way, because they've been using these widgets over and over. They get bundled. So that's what's happening here, like meta programs, cognitive biases. That's happening in that first 250 milliseconds. Now, if it's really scary, if it's a real tiger and freaks you out, this could happen in 150 milliseconds. It may not take the whole quarter of a second before throwing you into a reaction. And this is what athletes do in their training, to be able to train their reaction time, reaction/response, down to 150 milliseconds. This is why you can see players move like instantaneously. It's because they've trained it. And if you ever watch like Formula One videos of Formula One drivers training, they're catching balls and doing different things, and the purpose is to improve their reaction time. And then the second 250 milliseconds, so now we're just hitting a half second, and the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second. So you've got the quarter of a second, and then the second quarter of a second, and then it's the handoff to the conscious. Now, if you're distracted, this can be longer. That's why they say a person who's talking on a cell phone while driving, even if his hand's free, has a reaction time. They're really talking about response time of more like somebody who's alcohol impaired, because the distraction, it takes a while for it to catch up. And this quarter of a second is the consolidation. It's the consolidation of what occurred, what it's noticed here, consolidates. This is why cognitive biases is so difficult to overcome, because they're already in place. By the time you recognize it, it's already processing associations. You have to catch it before. So we can neutralize cognitive biases. This is where I started. I actually thought I was going to neutralize the cognitive biases, but there's too many of them, and they all follow a similar theme. So that's more about gaining control over this 1 second. This is your powerful present moment. You gain, it's a series of them, but you gain control of this second, and you make inroads into managing the cognitive biases because they don't fire. They don't come into play because you've taken them out of play. And there's an exercise I'll go through when I get to step 3 called the positivity exercise. But you literally change the design of how the subconscious initially creates these habit patterns. And that's why I call it a reset, because it was set from 0 to 7. This is why a lot of phobias, they occurred in that early age, 2, 3, 4. We don't need the associations for the most part of what was going on when we were 0 to 7. The world is completely different. People who are baby boomers didn't even know what a computer was, let alone have one in the home. And scientific calculators where you can accelerate through the math problems didn't show up until early 70s. So I mean, we were in a very grew up in a very analog world. And even if you look at the difference between millennials or Gen Z, then millennials, and then I'm sorry, Gen X, and then millennials, and then Gen Z, and then Alpha. Each one, and you look at what was going on from there 0 to 7. So, for example, with millennials 0 to 7, it was Atari and Nintendo, and then I can't keep track of all of it, but you can see that Gen Z was different, and they have kids walking around with iPads, etc. And now Alpha Gen Alpha, they're on phones sometimes before they can talk. They've got some kind of a similar thing to a telephone in their hand. Anyway, this handoff to the conscious is where we are. And when you get a handle on this, you'll be showing up as a better version of yourself, because that's what's coming over here. But at 11 million bits per second, you don't stand a chance of catching this once it fires. It's already listening, and so that 100 millisecond 4 period is already influencing. You're not even aware of it. The conscious mind is not even aware of what's going on. It's picking up at the subconscious level, which is where you get these anxieties. But what we can do is manage our physiology in such a way so that we're in a calm state. And that's what I'll talk about today, signals and levers, that we're in a calm state, that we're in a productive state, that we're in a present moment state, that we can deal with whatever's coming, because chances are whatever's coming is not a Serengeti tiger. So we don't need the full force of our cortisol and adrenaline coming into play. I'd say for the most part, we probably don't need that even once a year, because we're not facing life or death for the most of us. There are people who face life and death, and that's a different story. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about mental health. I'm talking about a process to understand how the conditioning was set up to begin with, and then using the design to reset how we want it to be for where we're going. And that brings us to this. Now, if you consider that 95% of everything we do is done by habit. Let's go here. "95% of everything we do is done by habit." You accept that. And then you accept that when we are seeing a person in action, what we're seeing are their habitual patterns, their habitual habit patterns. So this thing about you are not your behaviors, while that's true, but a person observing you will see a personality, and that personality reflects those behaviors. So the personality is a result of the habits. And what we want to do, if you have a quest, if you have a 10x, if you're focusing on purpose, we want to change in such a way that we have stability and allostasis as opposed to homeostasis. Now, this term is probably well known. Homeostasis is returning back to a level, and that level is not horizontal, it's probably upward, right? Because everything is getting a little bit more difficult, more challenges come in, and so you have this slightly upward trajectory, but it's still stability. And I'll say this is one of the reasons why I think hacks don't work. Hacks work for a while, but they fall off. You may have a hack, and I'm talking about neuroscience type hacks, these things that are just hacks, They don't work. Now, every neuroscience principle or idea is not a hack. What I'm saying is the hacks don't work because they're absorbed into the homeostasis. Remember, you got 100 billion neurons, thousands of connections for each, and it's generating this trillions and trillions of associations, and you just can't keep up with that. You're not going to beat that. Allostasis is stability, but an upward trajectory. And this is what you're going to need for that quest. Like I was saying, if you're going after a peak that you can't yet see, if you're going after this peak, if you're going after a peak that you can't see from back here, you know you need an upward trajectory to get there. Just like the through hiker, they need to go from 7 miles a day through 12 miles to 20 miles to 25 miles to 30 miles a day to meet their target. They can't see it, but they know that they need to have this stability. In a 90-day through hike, you will see a person go through a stabilized allostasis when it comes to how they're metabolizing, how they're walking, how they're recovering. All of those things come into play. This also shows up with martial arts. It shows up with special ops, because while they didn't have the brain scanning tools to know what was going on from a neuroscience standpoint, they had enough trial and error, and they had enough observation of nature, what's going on in nature, everything being atoms, makes it easier to get your head wrapped around that. So this allostasis is built into martial arts and the belts and the levels and the forms, and it's built into special ops, which is why they respond. People who've gone through special ops training respond the way they do, and why they're shifted. If you interact with somebody who's gone through special ops training or been in special operations in military, they're different. They show up differently because their conditioning has been reset. And that's one of the drivers I was using for coming up with the 7-step reset, because I wanted to look at, it had to break through all the hacks, had to break through all the here's how it works and all the amygdala and basal ganglia and that stuff. I had to work through that to come up with what actually happens. What is it that's actually happening from a recruit to a trained ranger or a trained Navy SEAL? What is going on? And this is going on is very fractal. So it's happening on a minute to minute, it's happening on hour to hour, it's happening week to week, it's happening through our lifetime. And once you see it and you see the fractal nature of it, then you can start making some inroads. And I would say it takes 90 days, about 90 days, for you to actually see it and real time make adjustments and have agency and personal leadership. But you go through a unconscious incompetence. 90 days takes you through the conscious incompetence and into conscious competence. Then I would say another 6 months to a year to get to unconscious incompetence. Unconscious competence. So another year to get to unconscious competence, where it's happening naturally, where it's happening, where it's always automaticity. So in that middle phase, when you're consciously competent, it works. But when you're under high stress or difficult situations, you feel like you're connecting dots. You're taking steps, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. And we want to get to the point where we have that allostasis happening all the time. Homeostasis is stabilizing for a consistent environment. Allostasis is stabilizing for a continually more difficult environment. And allostatic overload is the breakdown. If you think about fighters, they start with easier fighters to begin with because they've got to build up the confidence. They have to shift from here to here. And there's a point where if you go too far, if you push it too far, you get the breakdown, burnout, whatever, injury, mental checkout, whatever. So it's this allostatic load is important when you're designing these quests or your activities for these quests. And it's also important to identify allostasis. This is why in my dynamic leadership I talk about making sure that you have development plans that for the first 90 days, when a person gets hired, you want to have that 90-day plan, ideally even talking to them about the 90-day development plan, the first 90 days, before they accept it. You want them to know that there's going to be a development plan, and each day you're giving them more and more and more. What's happening in this is that the brain and central nervous system is anticipating the amount of demand that's coming. When it comes up short and it underestimates what's coming, it creates more neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is important because the neural pathways are sending signals. So if you lift up your arm, you're having several neurotransmitters involved. The glutamate, which is the signal from the central nervous system to the muscle, or to the neural pathway, and then you have it from the neural pathway to the muscle junction, which is called acetylcholine. Without neurotransmitter, the signal is going to be weak. And what you're doing is the brain is predicting how much demand is coming, providing enough neurotransmitter, because neurotransmitter is energy hungry, and when it comes up, when it predicts right, it pulls back on the neurotransmitters, making it efficient. The short version of this is if you've lifted weights or you've read anything about exercise, you know there's plateaus. These plateaus are really just points of efficiency where the brain has become efficient at predicting the upcoming load, and it levels off. Even though you're increasing the load, it gets efficient, and because it's about survival. It's not about you reaching your goals. This system is set up for survival. And that's why your bodybuilders will keep switching it up. So every 6 to 8 weeks, they're going to switch it up because they're keeping the body or the central nervous system in the brain underestimating what's needed, which throws in more neurotransmitter, which creates a stronger signal. Any fitness trainer will tell you what I just said is true. They may not label it as allostasis, homeostasis, and allostatic load, but again, we've arrived at these best practices based on what actually works. So now what we're going to do is, in step 2, I'm using physiology, and self-image as a roll-up. I won't go into depth on the self-image, but you can use self-talk as a proxy for what's going on with your self-image. And I said yesterday there's 3 kinds. There's degrading, where you're just calling yourself stupid or never amount to much. That's probably voices from parents or loved ones or teachers, whatever. And then you have your where you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You just had bad luck. And bad luck is you're creating new associations. So if it's bad luck, I just say, it's just, it happens. Bad luck happens to everyone. Sometimes I have good luck, sometimes I have bad luck. What you're doing is you're creating associations. So every time a negative word comes up in your self-talk, you're quickly making a new association. And that new association is now connected. So there was a trigger here. This trigger happened. You don't even know what it is, right? Because it's just that for period, this here, that triggers the negative word that comes up with a reminder that you're no good or whatever it is, and you're creating a new association. So now it's in that chain. And you do this enough times, this will collapse. And you're jumping from the trigger right to the new association. But then what happens, unfortunately, is there's another one waiting. There's another one waiting in the wings, right? So you have to do it continuously. And it could take weeks, it could take months to get rid of all the self-talk, but you don't have to get rid of all the self-talk to have a high self-image. You just have to keep working through it, and it's getting less and less and less and less, and eventually you'll have enough positive associations that you won't have to deal with that. But that's for you to work with. That's what you're going to work on. And I said I'm rolling up the physiology. It's mental, physical state of being, spiritual, and emotional. But I rolled it all up to physiology for this conversation because physiology is like a container for the emotional, and the physiology is a great dashboard. Now, there are signals that come, and one of the, again, I'm in the anxiety crushing stage right now, which is December. January, I'll get into the leading stage, which is self-mastery so we could lead others. And then February will be the actual leading of others, where we will be observing their step 2. Now, this is not about changing people. This is not about I'm going to change somebody. It's about recognizing where they are. In step one, as a leader, you're looking at their development. Where are they with respect to the development? What do they need work on? Well, let me give you some projects. This gets back to that development plan. You're paying attention to what's going to be needed out on those future peaks, and you're prepping now. You don't want to wait until you're in it. You can't train the new behaviors and the new identity when you're in it. You train them in advance, and that's your development plan. And so you work through a development plan. I said 90 days, but then following that 90 days, there's a 6-month development plan. Now you're getting into the allostasis, and that 6-month development plan will be different for an entry level employee, someone just out of school, versus an Well, this is interesting. It looks like my sound went out again. And it has to do with the backup power. And I must have a bad battery in the camera. And the backup power is somehow getting locked out of that. I'm not sure where it shut off. Fortunately, I do have a backup recording. I will put this out live on whatever you're looking at now, whatever channel you're watching this. I will replace the part 1 and part 2 with this updated version. And just to close that out, what I'll say is that if you don't have the ability to process the emotions real time, it's going to become a neurobiological event. And when that happens, it's now available for other associations. By allowing it to pass through, by processing it, it just moves on. It's energy, emotion, it's a signal. So you're going to ask yourself some things after you label it. What's the label? It's vulnerable. Why am I vulnerable about that? Oh, because I'm doing some things I've never done before, and I realize, okay, do I need to put in some safeguards, some guardrails? Do I need to maybe get somebody in the boat with me? It's always something different that you're using when it comes to processing the emotion. But by labeling it and saying what's coming up for me and what action should I take, what is the signal telling me that I need to do or engage or what have you, then you are able to, one, process it, but you're able to stay on an even keel. So even though emotional modulation is in step 5, you may be applying it in step 2, especially when we're talking about anxiety and all that. You could wake up feeling fine, but you're just like primed to fight or flight, and the first little thing that comes, oh, here we go again, it's going to be a bad day, and you're in this fight or flight. We need to get that processed out. And that's why I'm using Anxiety Crusher first, stop the spiral before it begins, because once you have that, and then you can trust yourself to not be triggered, then you have, it's like more personal power to take on new things, new quests, life design, focusing on purpose, all the things that you thought you couldn't do. It's now you're in a position to take those on. And then that's January, and the self-mastery. And then in February, it's observing it going on with other people. And while you can't change the other person, you can certainly, as a leader, create an environment that they're getting back to safety. This is why I talk about trusting thin slicing, trusting sensory acuity. Learn to trust it for yourself, but also trust it when you're observing other people. We're going to talk about what you can do and how to get through that when it comes to other people. But you first have to be aware of that there was a change, and those changes are subtle, and they're subtle and they're happening in the millisecond level, so you don't spot it. And people, because of survival, they are very good at masking those signals, but it's that first few milliseconds, first 100 or 200 milliseconds, that you see that flash. It's like in military training, you're seeing a flash of a tank go by. You don't necessarily know why you think it was a T7, but something was there. It's that same thing. You saw a flash. There was the neck tension. There was a flushing of the face. There was a fluttering of the eyes. There was a jerking of the head. There was the eyes going back and forth. There was the rocking back of the head. There was this tightening of the body. Whatever it was, you want to make sure that you're seeing it, and you pause and you go back. I'm ahead of myself. I'm into the February, but that's the point. But you first have to be able to spot it in yourself when you're under tension and anxiety and pressure, and when you're in a present positive moment state. Because once you can see it in yourself, it's very difficult to not see it in others. But both of them require a trusting of the thin slicing, the sensory acuity, and they both require you to be in a powerful present moment, which is why we're going through the anxiety first. You're not going to see those if you're already in fight or flight. You're not going to see those if you're primed for your own protection. You're not going to see them in protective mode. You're going to see them when you are in that powerful present moment mode, which is back to step 2, the check-in. Remember I said step 1 is where we are. Step 2 is checking in to see, are we close to being the best version of ourselves at any given moment, because there's another stimulus response cycle coming in any second, right? 33,000 seconds a day is basically, if you're awake 65,000 seconds a day, you're seeing a new stimulus response cycle every other second. So another one is coming. And are we in our best version of ourselves to be able to do that? And if not, let's modulate. So you're going to have some emotional modulation in the step 2, but we'll get into more depth around emotional modulation. Same concept, but we'll talk about it more when we get to step 5. That's it. Again, I'll put this out. I saw the audio went out. I'll put this out on the same platforms where you watch this, and they'll be available to you, the edited version with the audio. All right, take care.